Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Everyday Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Chase Green. This is a podcast where we remind ourselves that God deserves every praise from every creature every day. This is episode 12 of the current season, and the topic for today is the value of practical wisdom, part 1. We're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. I'll go ahead and begin by reading that. It says, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, Why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it." So this is pretty interesting, and it seems to be a pretty stark contrast to what we've studied so far in this book, or maybe not contrast, might not be the right word, but kind of a diversion, a different direction that Solomon is going to take it here for a little while. As I was reading through these chapters 7 and 8, I couldn't help but think of the book of Proverbs, and also the New Testament book of James, sometimes called the Proverbs of the New Testament. We'll bring in some of those verses as we go through these chapters. But what we want to notice in this section of chapters 7 and 8 for the next few weeks is the benefit of wisdom properly used. Remember that we noticed very early in this study how Solomon spoke against the idea of gaining wisdom for its own sake. And we talked about very early on in the study of this book that pursuing wisdom for its own sake is not going to lead to true happiness. But we don't need to mistakenly get in our mind that Solomon is against the idea of wisdom. We also could say the same thing about philosophy. Philosophy for its own sake is not good, but true biblical philosophy on things, that is, loving to think about and meditate on biblical virtues and concepts, that would be a good thing. Same thing with riches for their own sake. Can riches be used for good? Certainly. Are there examples of rich people in the Bible who did good? Absolutely. Job and Abraham and others. So we've talked about in this study so far that there are various things really that are brought to a level of idolatry when you really think about it, when the focus is such on those things that we forget our main focus. Again, fear God and keep His commandments, Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. And wisdom improperly focused on, that is, let me pursue wisdom so I can inflate my ego, or let me pursue wisdom so I can feed my pride. Well, that would be a bad way to use wisdom, but Solomon's not against the concept of wisdom. We don't want to swing the pendulum too far. And so here in chapter 7 and 8, we're going to see the importance of wisdom, the value, and the practical use of wisdom. Solomon wrote the book on wisdom, right? Proverbs, as well as Ecclesiastes. Solomon was the wisest man on earth while he lived. But even so, again, he got caught up in wisdom in such a way that he missed the forest for the trees. So what we want to do as everyday Christians is we want to have wisdom, not for wisdom's sake alone, but wisdom because we want to be pleasing to God in the way that we live our lives. So let's have wisdom, which comes from God's Word, and let's use that wisdom accordingly so that we can fear God and keep His commandments. So with that said, as kind of an introduction, really for the next few weeks of studying chapter 7 and 8, let's go back through chapter 7, and let's look at verses 1 through 12 once again. A good name, verse 1, is better than precious ointment. And we'll pause right there and get to the second half of verse 1 in just a moment. A good name, if you look at Proverbs 22, verse 1, it says, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. Titus 1, verse 6, in the list of qualifications for elders, is the idea of blameless or being above reproach. And so a good reputation is not only a good, wonderful thing that is to be chosen greater than riches, but also it is necessary. A reputation is, as they say, a terrible thing to waste. But many people do waste their reputations through dishonesty or open immorality, etc. It's hard to gain a good reputation back after losing it. I would say it is possible to gain a good reputation back. Just ask the Apostle Paul, right? He had a reputation of persecuting Christians, but after he became a Christian, he gained a reputation of being a tremendous force for good in the kingdom of Christ as an apostle. So certainly a reputation can be gained back, but it's very, very difficult. So again, a good name is better than precious ointment. It is good to have a good reputation. Now, the second half of verse 1 says, in the day of death than the day of one's birth. This is one of those shocking statements that Solomon makes in this book. If you went back to chapter 4 and verse number 2, that would be another example of this. Chapter 4, verse 2 says, therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living, who are still alive. So very, very sharp statement there by Solomon in chapter 4, verse 2, and also another one here in the second half of chapter 7, verse 1. The day of death, better than the day of one's birth. But when you think about it, it is true. When you think about a faithful child of God, when he dies, where will his eternity be spent? His eternity will be spent in heaven, versus when we're here on earth, we deal with all the toil and trials and tribulations and problems here on earth. So the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Verse number 2, I use this verse a lot at funerals. It says, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Now, how could that be? Again, this is a shocking statement. I don't know about you, but I love to go to a buffet, right? A house of feasting. That is a fun place to visit, if you know what I mean. But Solomon says that it's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to that house of feasting, that buffet, if you will. So why is that? Well, you look at the rest of the verse, it says, for that is the end of all men. That is, the state of death is going to be the end of all men, but the living will take it to heart. So when we go to funerals, when we go and honor the lives of our departed loved ones, and we mourn and we grieve their loss, it should give us all an opportunity, those of us who are still living, it should give us an opportunity to reflect on our lives, to self-examine, to see whether or not we're living in accordance with God's will. Verse number 3 says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Is Solomon saying that laughter is no good, that we just need to be stoic all the time? No. Proverbs 17, verse 22, Solomon also wrote, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit drieth the bones. Medically, we know this to be the case, that it is good to laugh. Laughter increases endorphins, which improve the immune system. Bad attitudes can lead to certain health problems as well. But Solomon's point in this verse is found in the second part. He says, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. How can this be? Well, I think he's definitely referring to the spiritual aspect of things here. It's often the case when someone hits an all-time low, physically speaking, that he realizes his spiritual need for the Father in heaven. I'm reminded of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. What did it take for him to realize his mistake and realize that he had it better as a servant of his father than what his current situation was? Well, he was eating slop with the pigs, right? He had squandered all of his living in riotous living and was down to getting his meals with the pig pen, in the pig pen. So that's what it took for him to realize that he had it much better when he was in the good graces of his father. And so we need to realize that sometimes too. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, verse 4, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. A person oftentimes, as a general principle, comes out from the school of hard knocks, if you will. He comes out a lot more wise from that when he comes out on the other side, when he learns from his mistakes. A person who just lives only for pleasure, mirth, or partying or whatnot, that would be a fool. So the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth or merrymaking or partying. Verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. Isn't that the truth? Our young people especially need to hear this. Proverbs has plenty to say about heeding the instruction of one's father and not forsaking the teaching of one's mother. See Proverb 1 verse 8. Notice that hearing the rebuke of the wise, actively listening when the wise rebuke us, that's better than hearing the song of fools. You've heard it said that Nero fiddled when Rome burned. Well, fools sing when foolishness is being practiced. I want to read a few verses here. Proverb 13, verse 18. Proverb 13, verse 18 says, poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards a rebuke will be honored. So we need to listen to the rebuke of the wise. Proverb 15, we're going to look at verses 31 and 32. It says, the ear that hears the rebukes of life will abide among the wise. He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding. And then Proverbs 27, verse 6 and verse 17. Proverb 27, verse 6 says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. If you ever have a friend who's willing to tell you the truth, even if it doesn't make you happy, you need to hold on to that friend. He might just be your best friend in the world. I'm reminded of what Paul told the Galatians at one point. He said, am I therefore your enemy because I tell you the truth? Again, the answer is no. He was their best friend in the world. And then Proverbs 27, verse 17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. We help each other to be stronger. And then one from Psalms as well. This is Psalm 141. Psalm 141, verse 5. It says, let the righteous strike me, it shall be a kindness, and let him rebuke me. It shall be as excellent oil, let my head not refuse it. Isn't that interesting? Even if it's a striking or a rebuke, it's a kindness to us. It's like excellent oil, so we don't need to refuse it. We need to be heeding the rebukes of those who are wise around us when we need it. Again, we'll go back to this. Chapter 7, verse 5, Ecclesiastes, it says, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. Verse 6, for like the crackling of thorns under a pot. That's one way to put it. Another similar phraseology, we might say, more modern type of idiom, nails on a chalkboard, right? That sort of thing. A very annoying, terrible sound, in other words. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. This is a very interesting expression that Solomon uses here. Immoral fools laughing at wickedness should be something that we don't want to hear. Solomon says it's vanity. It is emptiness. It is terrible. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 2, we studied this earlier in the season. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? What is the point of laughter and mirth if it's not in accordance with God's will, if it's not from a standpoint of fearing God? Again, there's nothing wrong with laughing. Laughing is a good thing. But we should not be laughing at evil things. We should not be entertained by evil things. Verse number 7, surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. Solomon alludes back to what he already covered back in chapters 3 and 4 about injustices that take place in life that had him down and even depressed for a time. Oppression destroys a man's reason. Perhaps the one doing the oppressing loses the ability to reason because he's just on autopilot of doing evil in oppressing people. Maybe Solomon might even be referring to the ones being oppressed, and that because of how they have been treated, they no longer reason through their situation, which could end up just causing them to be oppressed even more. A bribe debases or perverts the heart. That is easy to understand, I think, but very, very sad to see take place. Proverbs 17, verse 23 says, a wicked man accepts a bribe behind the back to pervert the ways of justice. Does that sound familiar when we look at many of our politicians today, right? Unfortunately, we're very familiar with this. Chapter 7, verse 8, the end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. This reminds me of seeing a project through all the way to its completion, coming from someone who has always struggled with, and I'm kind of letting you in on some of my weaknesses here. I've always struggled with procrastination. I have nightmares about old science projects in school and reports being, having to be written in college. Not really, but those kinds of projects in school, I always struggled because I waited till the very last minute to do those things. But so coming from this perspective, I certainly know how great it is to actually finish a project. Think about this, finishing our race, right, as Christians. We need to be able to not only start the race, which is certainly important when we're baptized into Christ, when we become Christians, but we need to live our lives as everyday Christians and ultimately see it through to the end of our lives so that we can be with God in heaven. Be thou faithful unto death, right? Revelation 2, verse 10. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. That's pretty self-explanatory, and to that we say amen. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Verse number 9, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. That sounds very similar to James 1, verses 19 and 20, which says, so then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Another verse would be Proverbs 14, verse 17, and that says, a quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. So we don't want to be that quick-tempered man. Verse number 10 in Ecclesiastes 7, do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Nostalgia, living in the past, longing for one's glory days, his younger years. Why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Why is this? Because there's no going back. We cannot change the past. Now, I don't believe it's wrong to look back fondly to days gone by and to perhaps even wish it were so that things were better as they used to be in the old days, but still, we cannot create a time machine So we don't need to dwell on those thoughts. We need to certainly learn from the past. I'm a big history buff. I love learning from history. I find it fascinating and very, very interesting. And, a very common saying in the field of history is those who do not know history they are doomed to repeat history. And so repeating the mistakes of the past, we don't want to do that. So there's certainly value in learning history, and there's plenty of history in the Bible as well. But we don't want to dwell on the past when we're living in the present and we're preparing for the future. So think carefully about that. And then here in verse 11 it says, "Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun." Wisdom and an inheritance both are great and useful for the one who is still under the sun, that is, still living. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 7 says, "Truly the light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun." But what about for the one who has passed away? Well, he's no longer beholding the sun, right? He's no longer under the sun. And also the inheritance, whether it be a financial inheritance or inheriting a business or whatnot, it's not going to do him any good, right? Because he is no longer among the living. Again, the Bible does not speak against the idea of inheritances. The Bible comes up with the idea of inheritance, I think. And certainly Proverbs talks about how it is good for us to leave an inheritance for our children and our children's children. And by the way, our home in heaven is described as an inheritance from our Father in heaven. So inheritances are a good thing, but we can't trust in earthly inheritances. Finally, verse number 12, "For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it." We're talking about the importance of having wisdom and the value of it and making sure that we put wisdom into practice in our lives. And here in verse 12, we see that wisdom and money are both great and useful while one is living, but wisdom really is for the purpose of helping us prepare for the next life so that we can fear God and keep His commandments and go and be with God one day in heaven. We're going to finish this episode with a reading of Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 13 through 18, which goes well with Ecclesiastes 7, verse 12. And then, Lord willing, next week we will continue with the value of practical wisdom, part 2. So this is Proverbs 3, verses 13 through 18. "Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For her proceeds are better than the profits of silver, and her gain than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things you may desire cannot compare with her, cannot compare with wisdom. Length of days is in her right hand, in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who retain her." Happiness in true wisdom and following that wisdom to fear God and keep His commandments. Isn't that the theme of this season? Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all, Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil, Ecclesiastes 7, verse 14. As we live our lives and we think about happiness and God wanting us to be happy, but He wants us to be happy the right way. And so let's exercise wisdom, let's fear God, and let's keep His commandments.